Okay, thank you, Vitska and Alexandra, for putting together such an urgent, rich, and engaging convention. And I mean engaging here both politically and intellectually. It also goes without saying thanks to Marwa Arsanios, whose sharp and vital work at the intersection of ecofeminist, anti-colonial, and anti-capitalist world-making has inspired us all to come together here. So thank you all. It has been also wonderful to partake in the morning working groups. We've had a lot of amazing discussions and food for thought to discuss. Maybe tomorrow we will attend to that. But I'm also very happy to be moderating today the conversation with such wonderful speakers. So just to give you a sense of the structure of the next hour and a half, I will start with a short introduction of the panel. Then each of the panelists will speak for about 15 minutes, followed by a 30-minute conversation amongst us, and finally some time for audience questions. We're gathering for this panel today as scholars, activists, to talk about life and death beyond the boundary, and to explore modalities of belonging to land and life that exceed the scripts of the liberal self-possessed subject, the juridical forms of property law, and related colonial forms of dispossession and violence. We gather today to ask what it means to insist on life and on life-making in spite of the ecocidal and colonial death worlds that the long and still unfolding durée of imperialism has ushered. In my work, looking at the settler colonial context of Palestine, I've been exploring questions of how Palestinian life is affirmed and reproduced in conditions of death, debilitation, and destruction. How does life persevere against all odds amidst settler colonial violence that is bent on debilitating environments and bodies? Although I've spent the last years thinking about these questions, I must say I do find myself these days at loss for words in the face of the cruelty, bloodiness, and wanton destruction that we've been witnessing in Gaza. As Samira Esmir recently said, and these words recently really stuck with me, whilst we must continue to write, speak about Palestine, protest, to demand to stop the genocide, perhaps we should also, and I quote, stay with the abyss, with the ruins, with the heavy human toll, and with the struggles of the living, unquote. It is precisely the struggles of the living from within the ruins of death that has animated a lot of our discussions today. As I am saying this, I am reminded of Yahya Bashir, a resident of North Gaza, who amidst imposed starvation took a journey back to the north in the midst of a genocidal onslaught in March 2024. He returned to the ruins of his home, removed the debris, plowed, and sowed the land. Quote, he said, I cleared the rubble from the Israeli airstrikes, tilled the soil and planted seeds. This is our home, our land. The convention's focus on usufructuaries of earth asks us to attune to ways in which we belong to the earth, putting into focus questions of life and death that cannot be only understood through the necropolitical enclosure and capture. Instead, as our conversation here will address, the coordinates of life and death might start to shift when questions of land reclamation, belonging, and abolition take center stage. The Israeli settler colonial control and plunder of Palestine is not just a project of eliminating a colonized population. It is also a project of decimating the land Palestinians inhabit. It is a project of diminishing the reproductive capacities of the land, its fertility, as a source of sustenance and livelihood for its inhabitants. Yet, amidst what can appear as the total destruction of forms of life, Yahya Bashir's journey attests to a Palestinian anti-colonial vitalism in which land is life in both its reproductive and emancipatory potentials. Oh, sorry. I should have given the, yeah, no worries. Thank you for, yeah, I should have given the text to the translator. Thank you. Today's interventions address these questions from a different yet converging vantage points. Brenna Bhandar's crucial work on the colonial lives of property shows how property law is central to the settler colonial dispossession and repossession of land, and whose emergence in conjuncture with modern concepts of racial difference and the human animated the colonial conquests of land. This, Bhandar terms the racial regimes of property. Today, Bhandar will reflect on the colonial and racial dynamics of modern property law. She will further address what it means to transform or reinstate a relationship to land that is based on usufructing, a practice that can potentially undo property through reimagining and disrupting the hegemonic framework of ownership. Following on, Yvonne Phyllis explores questions of property law and land reform to attend to the fraught relations between unfree farmers and landowners in South Africa. While South African land reforms were meant to grant rights to farmers through land redistribution, security of tenure, and land restitution, Phyllis shows that such rights did not redress the claim to belonging to the land. Phyllis explores how placemaking through the burial of ancestors on the land, that is through dwelling on the dead, becomes a powerful assertion of land reclamation for those who have endured exploitation on the farm. Placemaking affirms our relation to land in the face of continuous forms of enclosure and partition. Placemaking is a practice of establishing a sense of belonging to land that exceeds the hold of the colonizer or landowner. This is how Ruth Wilson Gilmore, our third speaker, considers the task and potential of what she calls abolition geography, which is a concept, or rather a guide, of making freedom tangible, using the resources and relations that are at people's disposal, wherever they are. Abolition's goal, Gilmore writes, is, quote, to change how we interact with each other and the planet by putting people before profits, welfare before warfare, and life over death. Her decades of extensive work, both scholarly and activist, on the prison industrial complex, or rather what she prefers to call carceral geographies, has detailed the ways in which racial capitalism shapes our everyday environments. Yet, she reminds us that carcerality, both in the form of prison infrastructures, but also as a structuring principle of statecraft, can never be completely totalizing. There are always social relations and material practices that emerge in its cracks, that unsettle its reach, and offer a point of connection to broader struggles invested in what she calls liberated life worries. So while this panel is informed by and attuned to the necropolitical destruction of life and land, it also explores how that death script can be undone through world-making practices. We do this, to quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore's abolition geography, quote, by seizing the particular capacities we have and repeating ourselves, trying every little thing, going and going again, we will, because we do, change ourselves and the external world, even under extreme constraints, unquote. While our speakers need no introduction, I would still like to read their bios to highlight the many important contributions they've made in both scholarship and organizing. So our first speaker for today is Brenna Bhandar. Brenna's primary research has centered on the colonial foundations of modern law, taking property, broadly conceived, as its main focus. This research culminated in the publication of her book, Colonial Lives of Property, Law, Land, and Racial Regimes of Ownership, which excavates the co-emergence of racial subjectivities in modern property law in various settler colonies. We will first give the floor to Brenna for 15 minutes, and then I will introduce our other two speakers.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And also thank you to Marwa and Witzka for the invitation to be here. I'm really quite honored to be in the company of so many people doing amazing work on property and this idea of reversal of turning property back into land, back into earth. And I feel like a lot of my comments are things that we've been talking about all day long. So in any case, what I want to do in this 15 minutes is just give you a little bit of a snapshot of a longer paper. Hopefully this piece of that paper will have some coherence. In the paper that this is drawn from, I advance the argument that property law operates as a form of warfare. Whilst the term lawfare encapsulates the idea that law has long been the primary means of dispossession and exploitation in colonial contexts, I want here to think about the specificities of the relationship between property and sovereignty and how an originary commingling of private and public forms of power expressed through property law contain and suppress resistance to extractivist forms of accumulation. So there's sort of there's many ways of thinking about property as warfare, of course. In some sense, it's perhaps, maybe it's common sense to the people in this audience, but I want to just briefly outline what I'm trying to do in the larger work. Property as warfare can be conceived of, on the one hand, as this quote from Aliez and Lazzarato tell us, from the beginning, liberalism has been a philosophy of total war. So property, when it comes to enclosure, and we're talking about private property, of course, settler colonialism, the ideology of the possessive individual, and as I write about in Colonial Lives of Property and elsewhere, the violence of abstraction when we think about how the legal form of property is constituted. All of these elements of liberalism, we can see that property, in fact, and the violence that it entails operates as a form of warfare. Okay, so that's the first sense in which we can think about property as warfare. The other way in which we can think about property as warfare, and this is what I'm going to focus on in my 15 minutes, is the way in which this longue durée liberalism and liberal forms of private individual property ownership are the underlying foundation for what is parasitic on that, which is a neoliberal legal architecture of financialization, real estate speculation, etc. We can think about the relationship between settler colonialism and fascism. We can think about the possessive individual in relation to the entrepreneurial subject. And when we think about the violence of abstraction and the legal form of property, we can think about that as interrelated, I suppose, with increasingly complex forms of algorithmic abstraction. So when we think about, for instance, the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008. So this second way of thinking about property law as a form of warfare that I want to focus on. Now, the use of the term warfare to articulate contemporary modes of capitalist accumulation is, of course, related fundamentally to the notion of crisis. Crisis, a key analytic for Marx, has come to contain multiple meanings, encompassing at a very general level the dialectical transformation of the building blocks of a capitalist economic system, and also, crucially, the state itself. And here, just to quote from Ruthie, hello Ruthie, I don't as Ruthie has written, objectively crises are neither bad nor good, but crises do indicate inevitable change, the outcome of which is determined through struggle. Struggle, like crisis, is a politically neutral word. Everyone struggles because they have no alternative. Now, Ruthie and others go beyond economistic understandings of crisis as the result of contradictions that inhere in capitalism, and Ruthie, along with Tony Negri and others, have unearthed the ways in which revolutionary resistance, labor organization, riot, and revolt on scales both national and global, and also more locally, have constituted primary forms of a crisis to which capitalist interests have been forced to respond. The second part of, or the second quote from Ruthie is, by centering attention on those most vulnerable to the fatal couplings of power and difference signified by racism, we will develop richer analyses of how it is that radical activism might most productively exploit crises for liberatory ends. Now, that is something I think we should all keep in the forefront of our minds, even though I'm not going to talk about that very much in this presentation, but I think this is a really important part of thinking about crisis. So the concept of crisis contains within it both the general overarching tendency of capitalism's contradictions repeatedly to produce different impasses that affect practically every level of social relation, but also the specific or particular forms of resistance and refusal, be it in relation to working conditions, racial violence, and as I want to try and relate this thinking of crisis to, I want to try and think about the climate crisis, the crisis of climate change. Now, I'm just going to turn for a minute to the work of Tony Negri, who in an essay on Keynes, originally published in 1968, developed several key arguments that I think are still very much relevant to our understanding of contemporary modalities of crisis. So one of his insights, not particularly controversial, but I think just helpful to recount, is that the move to contain labor militancy, which in the interwar period was connected in multiple ways to the October Revolution of 1917, takes place through the creation of a welfare state, a Fordist regime of accumulation, etc. The state becomes central to the economic, political, and juridical response to crisis. And the planner state is the primary actor in giving economic and political imperatives life through its juridical apparatus. And that's one of his insights that I want to emphasize here, that law is fundamental to the state's role as a key agent in mediating between capitalist interests and workers, or to gesture towards Negri's later work with Michael Hart, any constituencies that threaten or even have the potential to threaten the stability of the capitalist order. And here again, we can consider how the dual crisis presented by the climate breakdown, so the climate breakdown itself, but also all of the forms of resistance to it that are emerging, is also central to the rise of authoritarian regimes everywhere, and also this emergence of fascism that we are seeing. The second key insight I want to draw from Negri's writings of this period is that this new form of state required direct and indirect forms of violence to maintain what he calls the precarious, controlled equilibrium between worker militancy and capitalist interests. And I suppose what I'm arguing is that even though we have surpassed the moment in which he was writing, these insights about both the centrality of the juridical to contending with crises that are produced by challenges to the legitimacy of colonial capitalism, but also the place of violence in this response to crisis is incredibly salient. So just to quote from Negri in an essay from 1980, under fascism, the sentence was the firing squad. We are therefore happy that fascism has been overthrown. It is, however, the only reason for us to feel any pleasure in the fall of fascism. In all other respects, the law is unchanged. In fact, repressive laws have since been increased enormously in characteristics of those applying in wartime. You can be arrested and interrogated without legal assistance and held for long periods of time. But as I said above, it is the preventative imprisonment that have reached levels that are quite incredible. So just two comments. One is that he's writing that in 1980. So, this is before the global war on terror. It's before this extreme intensification of policing and incarceration that we've seen since 1980. But also that, the other comment I would add is that, of course, preventative imprisonment, preemptive, preventive detention has a very long colonial history that, marks actually a kind of continuity with colonial past and the present. Okay, so the other aspect of this, which I'm not going to talk about just for shortage of time, is, again, Ruthie's writings on the anti-state state, which are also really important to think about in relation to the concept of crisis. Okay, but I'm going to turn to think about, and what I want to suggest here, after just very briefly sketching out this work on crisis, is to suggest that the climate crisis is posing new challenges for the warfare state as the agent that seeks to cancel out the future by prolonging the present. However, the future that is being canceled is not a communist revolutionary horizon, but the survival as the world as we know it. So the warfare state is conducting, as it has always done, a counter-offensive against those who resist the extractivist exploitation of the land. As Joanne Barker has noted, quoting from a joint report of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, extractive industries operate with impunity in Indigenous territories. And Joanne Barker, in her book, The Red Scare, reveals the manifold ways in which the treatment of Indigenous land defenders as terrorists is an essential component in the way the state capital nexus upholds extractivism. This quote by Andreas Malm also, I think, just to pivot now to the realities of this particular crisis, this existential crisis that we're facing with climate breakdown. There can be only one accurate description of the situation: out of control. The classes ruling this planet are bent on burning what remains of it as fast as physically possible, and nothing has yet reined them in to even the slightest degree. They are utterly demoniacally, infernally out of control. From this can follow only a single possible logical conclusion: we have not yet done enough. We must try something more. We don't need any advanced conceptual maps to take us in the direction of Wet'suwet'en. So Wet'suwet'en are the sacred headwaters of the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en First Nations people, who their territories are in the northern part of what is now called British Columbia. And they, for over a decade, reoccupied their ancestral traditional lands to try and block the construction of the Coastal GasLink pipeline. Now the corporations have drilled under their sacred headwaters, but the resistance continues. It is fossil capital itself and all the immutable realities it creates on a daily basis that push us there. A refusal to accept this conclusion in principle while leaving all the details to be worked out is tantamount to giving up on life on this planet. And in that short pamphlet from which this is derived, Malm is trying to ask us to reconsider the sacredness of private property. Why has private property remained off the table for climate activists in terms of their actions, which is an interesting question. Now, I want to, just by way of conclusion, sort of turn back to thinking about settler colonial warfare in its literal form. And to think about the re-territorialization that's happening in Gaza. And I'll just say some of the images are actually quite violent. So this image, I think, is incredibly violent, but it's one of these sorts of photos that, of course, the IDF soldiers have been posting probably in their thousands, I don't know, hundreds or thousands, which are like kind of trophy photos of war booty. And here, of course, the Salman Abu Sitta's Atlas of Palestine is what he has propped on his lap. Now, we can think about the relationship between the violence of reterritorialization and the crisis posed by climate change. In its sovereign lust for absolute control over land, the settler colonial drive to eliminate the native, particularly the native who resists the violence of colonization with acts of violence, has always been a central dimension of the political order that has produced the climate crisis. The current devastation of Gaza has also been its reterritorialization. The IDF has paved a road from east to west across the Gaza Strip, dividing it into northern and southern parts, cutting Gaza City off from the rest of the Strip. And as several former IDF personnel have stated, the primary purpose of the new road is to facilitate logistical and military control in the region. Another aspect of the reterritorialization of the Gaza Strip, and here, of course, we want to acknowledge how even the spatial designation of the quote-unquote Gaza Strip was a product of the Nakba, is the retooling of what looks like an urban planning map to affect the forced displacement of 1.7 million Palestinians. So the map that has been used to warn Palestinians to evacuate particular areas and to go to the supposed safe zones where they have also been bombed is not a map that corresponds to Palestinians' relationships to the land and the territory, their homes, but rather a map that looks very much like land lots that Israelis devised half a century ago when they had short-lived plans to settle the Gaza Strip, which are, of course, now in play once again. Israeli settlers and the likes of Jared Kushner have, in an astonishingly crass short circuit, posited the genocide as a helpful precursor to the development of lucrative real estate on the Gaza seafront. Israel has granted companies gas exploration licenses in violation of the prohibition against exploitation of natural resources by an occupying power. The unlawful exploitation of Palestinian natural resources, and in particular, the capture and control of water resources, was at the center of the Maldives submissions to the ICJ in the case pertaining to the legality of Israel's continued occupation, which I found really interesting that the Maldives, who are facing their own existential crisis in terms of rising seawaters, really made the links between the illegal occupation of Palestine and the climate crisis. The property logics at play in the warfare state, and here I'm concluding, and the continual repetition of annihilating colonial violence, destruction and assertion of control over the very things necessary to maintain and reproduce life, have led the Colombian president Gustavo Petro to state that Gaza is a rehearsal of the future. The war itself, of course, is a climate disaster in terms of emissions and the poisoning of the soil, the destruction of water sources, etc. But more than that, this current conjuncture is revealing the ever-shrinking space between liberal democratic capitalism and fascism. Something happened to the Gustavo Petro quote. It didn't quite come through, I think, when there was, to contrast the visualizing Palestine graphic, which just kind of focuses on the genocide as a climate issue. Gustavo Petro, as I mentioned, has linked the levels of dehumanization and violence to what is on the horizon for the rest of us as the climate breakdown progresses. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brenna. Next, we have Yvonne. Yvonne Phyllis works as the director of The Forge. The Forge is a community-centered, progressive, feminist, Pan-African project in Johannesburg. Through her work at The Forge, she has worked with a wide range of professionals, community groups and organizations, social movements, women's organizations and trade unions. Prior to joining The Forge, Yvonne worked as a lecturer at Rhodes University, Makhanda, where she taught comparative politics and international relations at the Department of Political and International Studies. Phyllis's research interests include farm workers and dwellers, lived experience and struggles, equality and feminist futures, agrarian reform, and land redistribution in South Africa. Yvonne, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Layal. Hello, everyone. Hello, Prof. Ruthie. I'm very happy to be in this panel with you once again. I enjoy being in conversation with you, and I look forward to being in conversation with you, Layal, and Brenna, and everyone else. But also, I want to introduce myself in this way. Molweni, igama lam nguYvonne Busisiwe Phyllis. Ndingumamsukwini, uDibashe, uChwama, uSomda, uSomchiza, uNdlela, uNdlakwe, uNjabomvu. I have just introduced myself and said my name is Yvonne Phyllis and recited my clan names because I think of myself as a longer lineage of thinkers. They have influenced who I am. They have brought me here. They have influenced my thinking. A lot of how I view the world has been through stories and conversations with my grandfather, my grandmother, my father, and my mother. And I wanted to honor them today. I think I'm going to, Brenna, I'm going to start with a quote from your book, the chapter titled Life Beyond the Boundary. In your book, Colonial Lives of Property, Law and Land, and Racial Regimes of Ownership. I want to do this because I think it really helps me get to begin my contribution. Brenna writes, indigenous scholars and activists have explained how indigenous ontologies incorporate an embodied and conceptual relationship to land, animals, and plants that reflect ways of being quite alien to capitalist commoditivized visions of land. And that is where I would like to start my contribution and use two quotes that usually come together when farm workers talk about land and belonging. And this is what they say. Inkaba yam ilapha lo ngumhlaba wokhokho bethu. This is the isiXhosa language, which is my home language. What that means is that my umbilical cord is here. And this is the land of our ancestors. In South Africa, while not practiced by all people, one of the most powerful ways of demonstrating connection between people and the land, as expressed by farm workers, is the practice of ukurumbela inkaba, to place the umbilical cord in the soil. to symbolize a marking of land where one's home is. Often, people introduce themselves in this manner. I am Zodwa. I live in Gauteng, but my umbilical cord is in Nyaga. This is to signify oneness with a place to return to, a place of belonging, at times, a place that marks ties with a greater or longer lineage, a home in the physical and the spiritual world. For many, a place where people choose to be buried. To think of land this way, then, is to also think of oneness with the soil of a place in a chosen way, to think of belonging, to think of home, and to think of being. So I wanted to start this way as a way to emphasize what Brenna was saying in the book, that there are other ways of thinking about land as life, land as being, land as existence, in ways that is in complete contradiction with the capitalist mode of thinking about land as property. We asked in the session earlier, when does earth become land? When does it become property? And when do people become labor? And sometimes this is misunderstood. Farm workers understand the concept of work very well, but are very critical of the concept of labor as it exists in private property, but also in capitalist ways of thinking about land, what land is for. I am interested also, when thinking about the farms, in this idea of generational labor. The South African farms, maybe as a way to provide some context, South African farms, it is not uncommon, in fact it is very common, for two groups of people to exist on one land, others as people that work the land, and others as people that own the land, and to exist on that land for the same amount of time. If, for instance, we're talking about 5 generations of farm workers, we're then also talking about 5 generations of farm owners. But the farm workers don't exist on that land securely. And their belonging is always questioned. So I'm interested, and farm workers are interested in those questions. What does it mean to exist on land, to provide generational labor that contributes to the productivity and the sustenance of those farms, but for that labor to be devalued and for you to exist, but legally to not exist in ways that the owners do? So that is my preoccupation with the idea of generational labor. And I also bring farm workers and farm workers' voice to my presentation because they are the people that have brought me here, and they are the people that have brought me to this work. On the aspect of generational labor, I'll just very quickly quote from 2 farm workers. I had more, but I think for the sake of time, I would like to bring their words as opposed to just mine, because I think that's important. This is Mamgcina. And again, I'm very deliberate, and this is a choice farm workers and myself made when we were making a documentary known as Nyaga Farm Workers. That on the documentary, we are not going to use our individual names, but we are going to use our clan names because we understand our labor struggles and our land struggles to be connected to those of our ancestors. So I quote from Umamgcina, but her actual name is Ntombizandile Lolo. She's from the Gcina clan. We grew up on a farm known as Kwakinki, Elizabeth Farm. This is where I was born and grew up. So was my father. My father's umbilical cord is buried there too. My child, it is the main thing that makes your spirit feel troubled even as you are asleep, because my grandfather is buried there, my grandmother is buried there, and my father is buried there. I have a right to say that this is our ancestral land because these people were born here on the farm. They worked here until their physical strength was diminished here. They also left their offsprings here. But once they have no more strength, they die and leave us on this earth. We get chased out of the farms. Those are Mamgcina's words. I'm now going to read words from Bawo Umkwai. About my family who worked on the farm. All of them worked on the farm. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather worked on the farm. My father and his brothers worked on the farm. My aunts worked on the farm. They all died there on the farm. My grandparents also died there on the farm. As a result, I also worked there for 20 years. We all, his family, Mkwai's family, worked on the same farm. As a result, my wife also worked on the farm. When we left, we also worked there for 20 years. She also worked there for 20 years in the kitchen at the farm owner's compound. She too got nothing. She left empty-handed. I am telling you about the farm. It is really painful. The reason why we endure so much is because once you reach the point of thinking about the graves, the bones of my grandfathers and fathers are laid to rest there. So I endure because sometimes I would take time to go and clean the graves and feel a sense of joy in me. But then I looked at the situation and I thought to myself, I can't also die here. And then I left. Now I think to myself, while I am here in the township, I wonder if I would want to go there and pay a visit to the graves. Would I be accepted pleasantly or not? That is the part that makes me beg sometimes, because my forefathers and mothers were all laid to rest there, and my uncles too. So I bring this work not only to speak about the unfreedom, of course that's an important part of the contribution, but also, Prof. Ruthie, to speak about presence on the farms and insisting to stay on the farms. So many, for many, and I've spent enough time with people to know that this does not, reflect my thoughts about our conversations, anything but. But for many people, the quotes I've just read, can be seen as an expression of the manifestation of unfreedom, which is experienced by workers in South African farms. But I want to also make the point that it is also an expression of what I mentioned earlier, generational labor, as well as about living on the farm over several generations, and what it means in a context where you exist or people exist and live on land, but not recognized as belonging to the land. I've previously argued elsewhere that under these kinds of systems, by which I mean, of course, colonialism, apartheid, and also democratic South Africa, I'll come to that later. Under these systems in which farm workers are tied to land, yet are denied belonging to it for several generations, their employment encompasses all aspects of their world: to work the land, to live on the land, to nurture and sustain the land, to raise children on the land, to bury family and loved ones on the land, to have a connection with the land, to love the land, and to call the land home, but never to securely belong to the land. The denial, of course, is from the farm workers themselves, and we can talk about that later. And of course, they can't do this because of the predominant private property paradigm, which gives them, as owners, exclusive rights on land which they share with others, by which I mean the people that work and live on the land. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to move to the part about the graves. So I spoke earlier about the new language that farm workers give us when they give us this term, "Inkaba yami ilapha, my umbilical cord is here." And the significance of that, because we spoke a lot earlier about language. There has to be a language that recognizes the ways in which people speak about the land they're on. So for many of the farm workers, as expressed by Mamgcina and Uba Umkwai, their ancestors' graves are in many instances proof of the intimacy between work and life on the farms. The concepts of home and belonging are also influenced by the ancestral connection between the living, kunye nezinyanya, by which I mean the living and the ancestors. Therefore, as I'm about to conclude this part about belonging and the graves and labor, before I speak a little bit about what Layal said I should touch on, which is sort of the legislation and how it has failed and why we have the case that I've just presented. Therefore, it is about their presence on the land as people that live on it and work it, and that of their ancestors who are buried in the land. They are asking questions, farm workers, about how it is possible to live together on land but not belong to it equally. Basically a critique on private property. As explained by Usufructuaries above, graves then in their context cannot be seen as the end of life. Part of their placemaking is to say, as shown by Mamgcina, we are here, our forefathers are here, our forefathers are buried here, therefore we are not going anywhere. Insisting to stay on farms in which they are outcasted, but claim their ancestral ties to the land through the labor of their ancestors and their graves. those who worked the land, and those who are buried there, their ancestors. Hence, the two political claims. Inkabayam ilapa, my umbilical cord is here, and lo, kumhlaba wokhokho bethu. This is the land of our ancestors.
Hello. Thank you very much, Yvonne. Yes. Thank you, Yvonne. And of course, last but not least, Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Ruth Wilson Gilmore is a writer, educator, and researcher. She's a professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences and American Studies at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, where she's also the director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. Gilmore writes about abolition, racial capitalism, organized violence, organized abandonment, changing state structure, the aesthetics and politics of seeing, labor and social movements, and internationalism. She's the author of the prize-winning book Golden Gulag, Prison Surplus Crisis and Opposition in Globalizing California. Other recent books include Abolition Geography, Essays Towards Liberation, edited by Brenna Bhandar and Alberto Toscano, and Stuart Hall Selected Writings on Race and Difference, co-edited with Paul Gilroy, amongst many other publications. Thank you so much for joining us online, Ruth, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. It's a little unsettling because all I can see is a still that says Bach, and I can't see any of you. So I will talk to myself and hope that others will hear. I'm delighted to be here. Thank all of the organizers for putting together such an important, indeed urgent, conversation that I understand has come from many conversations and will carry out into many more conversations. And all of the conversations, as I understand them, are shaped by action that exceeds the conversational mode. That said, the importance of gatherings like this cannot be overstated. They're essential for us to come together, to share ideas, to help one another see more clearly, more deeply, more broadly about what is possible, and ultimately to carry the movement through movements toward the goal of unifying struggles everywhere. When we look back over time, when we look back over the 500 and some odd years history of colonial exploitation, chattel slavery, and capitalist modernity writ large, we see that oppositional, which is to say revolutionary movements, arose in many ways from always concrete struggles, but also grew and flourished because people could come together and find out from each other how to do things, what kinds of analyses made more sense given the actual ongoing struggle on the land and on the sea, and how to build revolutionary strength. We know this from the entire history of the Comintern. We know this from the many meetings of the Pan-African Congresses. We know this from the Tricontinental Institute, the earlier one, not the one that exists now, one which where among others, Amilcar Cabral spoke. And he talked, I thought very importantly, not only about the particular characteristics of the struggle that he and the party for the African Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde was engaged in, but how that struggle connected with other struggles. He talked about that, but he also talked about how important it was to come together to laugh, to have enormous release of joy and reduction of stress that laughter brings. So I do hope those of you who are together at this conference will find some time to laugh as well, even in the midst of so much horror. I have been talking for a while with comrades around the country, around the United States, North America, more generally around Europe, in South Africa, and by way of online presence with comrades in Brazil and elsewhere, about how abolition can only be understood if we understand it as an intense and relentless way to reorganize the way land is used. That is to say, to reorganize laws, to reorganize the notion of private property, to reorganize the actual practices that lead to the agricultural, extractive, residential, or other use of land, and of course, therefore, of water. And I had the great fortune to have spent many days in South Africa a few months ago with Comrade Yvonne. And we did 2 days of political schools in KwaZulu-Natal, and then 2 more days of political school in Johannesburg. All of the schools organized by and peopled by members of the Abashali community. And Abashali, for those of you who don't know, is a movement that has been growing in South Africa since, about 2005, currently has about 135,000 members. And the immediate, concrete demand that brings people to Abashali is the demand for a place to live, a place to have a house. So rather than romanticizing the idea that people can coordinate their energy and resources and put together a house on a bit of land and in conjunction with neighbors along the way form a community, what Abashali is and what many other self-built communities around the world are movements that insist that the realization of the concrete demand, the demand for a place to live, must extend to undoing the property relation to land. And therefore, for everybody who is a member of Abashali, the requirement is that there cannot be any underlying capitalist value imagined to attach to the fact of the houses being there on the land. That means they can't be sold, they can't be rented. They can only be used. Land, in this case, fulfills only its social purpose. But in fulfilling its social purpose, it is also running up against all of the forces of legal and otherwise organized violence that insist that the only purpose of land should be to produce value in the form of surplus under capitalism. So those who are part of Abishali, just as those who are part of the MST, and I imagine there are people there at the conference who can speak more authoritatively than I on both of these examples. What they do then is not only come together, build their communities and defend their communities, but they also come to an understanding through the struggle of learning as well as the struggle of doing of what it means to make, like literally make, socialism from the ground up. So as we think about abolition and think particularly about how much of contemporary abolition arose in an understanding and a critique of the all-purpose use of criminalization to solve, which is to say displace, social, economic, and political and other land use problems, then we can see as well that abolition really does require us to change one thing, which is everything. The question of how all kinds of people in all sorts of situations come to confront abstract principles and interpret them toward the purpose of reinventing themselves and reinventing the world is really central to what both Comrade Brenna and Comrade Yvonne were talking about, as well as the little bit of the prior conversation I heard with Comrades Vidska and Marwa. And that is that the question of abstract principles always looms large in all of the ways that we're thinking and doing concerning changing land use. And yet, it also seems to be true that very few people stop what they're doing and do something else, or persist in doing certain things in order to inhabit or resolve abstract principles. Rather, the combination of concrete demands, which is to say the realization of concrete needs, the organizing in order to do something about something that bites into their existence. And that bite can be material, it can be spiritual, but it bites. Combines with a constant reflection on what the abstract principles are, whether they have to do with the kinds of things that Comrade Yvonne was talking about, the sense that whoever on paper owns land, it belongs to those whose umbilical cords are buried there. Also, to move elsewhere in the world, whoever on paper owns land, it ought to be passable by, and perhaps also inhabitable by whoever needs to pass through or to stay put. These also are central abolition principles. Those principles, of course, run up against many different kinds of obstacles, some of which are necessarily contradictory, almost as it were, without relief. For example, the idea that people on this planet ought to be able to move around or stay put, right, as a general principle, then runs up against the contradiction of we who also believe that nobody should be able to privatize land and make it into what it has become in so many parts of the world. So resolving that is an ongoing process that will never end. And there are various examples of how people struggle with these principles and processes that I can share with you from other comrades' research. For example, my dear friend and comrade Rachel Goff has been writing quite a bit about what she calls capture land. I think the term is not her invention, but she has made the most of it in Jamaica. And what she is studying and trying to come to an understanding of is how people who are the descendants of slaves in Jamaica have, over decades and indeed centuries, taken control of bits of land on that island and refuse to have the land that they say they have always used to become entitled private property for them. They are insisting that the land has been out of the market and should stay out of the market. And they struggle now against dispossession by tourism, but they also struggle against dispossession by a certain form of the planner state that is trying, but will always fail, to realize a capitalist planning system that somehow will produce emancipation of people and the land. There are many other examples that I could talk about. There's the research of Nisreen El-Amin, who has written remarkably about Sudan, Francesca Manning, who has done a lot of work on the entire sort of global class of landlords or landowners, and asks us to think about how those people as a class are in contradiction to even the capitalists who are not landlords. And that then asks us to imagine how we can intervene in that crisis and deepen it. I have a few minutes left, so there are a couple of things I'd like to talk about. The question of rehearsal, which I'm very happy has come up a few times, is one that I find really exciting and helpful as we look at what people do in their everyday efforts to organize themselves, ourselves, to derive meaning from their organizational activities and to chart a future that is possible, that is not the future that President Petro of Colombia says is the future that we see in the horror of the present of Gaza. And thinking about rehearsal as something that we do and do again reminds me that one of the major lessons I ever learned from being with artists and teaching artists, and once upon a time, a long time ago, working as a student in a fine arts program, is something that I also learned from athletes, and that is the visceral fact that practice makes different. And if rehearsal is something that's ongoing, and if what we're trying to do is figure out how to take the practices we already have and extend practices further, then rehearsal as practice is then making different, which is the point. My alarm has just sounded, so I think I need to end here. And I will end by saying that one of
you can have a bit more time, five more minutes.
Oh, okay.
Is that okay? Okay,
Right.
cool.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. All right. 5 minutes. So 2, not 1. One of the really profound lessons that Comrade Yvonne shared with us when talking about the graves of her ancestors brings to mind the sense that is difficult to say out loud today, but I think must be said out loud all the time. And that is in the context of revolutionary work. And this is what people are trying to do, is make revolution. Death is not a defeat. And while I've written a lot and others have written plenty about group differentiated vulnerability to premature death, which is what racism is, and the entire genocide in Gaza is racist murder, it is also true that death will not defeat us. We have not and will not be defeated. And there are shreds of memory, whether it's a sense of where one's umbilical cord is, or the notion of where one's sister is buried, or one's cousin, or the vast Atlantic Ocean that contains the bones of tens of millions of people kidnapped from Africa who did not make it to enslavement in the Western Hemisphere. I am not romanticizing death, but rather pointing out that we can think and must think in a revolutionary way about death, in part because the dominant discourse that those who support Israel put forward is that they have the principal right to define what not being defeated by death should be. We refuse that. We refuse the racist logic. We refuse the notion that all Jewish people are the same as Israel. We refuse the logic that some deaths are more important than others. And we insist that whether we're thinking about land as the source of all life, whether we're thinking about the fact that on the planet, agribusiness, which is dominated by 5 or 6 global firms, when we follow it all the way down to the ground, as Maria Luisa Mendonça teaches us, we see that most direct producers are small producers. That doesn't make them perfect, but it gives us an idea of how thinking concretely opens possibilities for organizing and making a different future. So thank you for the time that we've been able to share today. I'm very happy to be here, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you. Okay, may I ask, please, the speakers to step on stage? Are we visible to you, Ruth, on Zoom? No. Okay, where's the camera directed? Is it directed at us or not?
No, I don't have any camera. All I have is the Bach logo.
Oh,
I haven't
sorry.
seen anybody.
Sorry about that. Okay, thank you so much for the 3 speakers for wonderful presentations, and thanks a lot, Ruth, for ending your intervention by reminding us all that revolutionary death is not a defeat, and I think this is something we should all hold on to when leaving this space today. And hopefully we'll come back to that later. But so there's a lot of food for thought. Many questions came up from the interventions. But I will start first with a question to Brenna. In your presentation, you speak about kind of the contemporary modalities of crisis under capitalism. And you particularly state that settler colonial drive to eliminate the native and destroy their livelihood and the resistance that kind of ushers has been at the center of the climate crisis. I was very interested in that particular assertion that you made. And you say also that crisis that has kind of both been faced by a rise of fascism and a fascist kind of response. You also mentioned that radical activism around climate crisis, and I would like you here to also maybe reflect on the connected struggles between climate crisis and Palestine activism. You say that radical activism can explore crisis for liberatory ends. And I was wondering maybe if you can reflect a little bit on that. And maybe we can start with that, then I'll move on to other questions. Yeah.
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you very much for those interrelated questions. I think there's been an increasing recognition recently, in part through some of Andreas Malm's work, but I think also the long work of indigenous scholars and activists, so before Andreas Malm, who have shown us how the settler colonial drive to eliminate the native is at its root about control and exploitation of land. And that when we look at a settler colonial economy, and we were talking a little bit about we're talking a lot about this in our discussion group earlier, it's never just about land. It's actually that legal forms of abstraction, which is to say the commodity form of law, is really one of the main mechanisms through which our world is divided up into these categories of forests to be cut down, of land to be turned into property and developed into real estate, or in other places, capitalist agriculture. You know, areas that become mines, you know, water resources as being separate from land. You know, all of those ways of seeing the world that we live in are really, you know, they've been fabricated and produced through colonial capitalism, just to put it, you know, in a nutshell. And so there is an increasing recognition that it's actually private property, whether that be in land, whether that be the privatization of water resources, whether that be, and when we think about private property, we always end up thinking about title deeds and land ownership, but let's remember that private property is hugely capacious. And when it comes to settler colonial economies, you're also talking about licensing regimes. You're talking about leases. You know, that's how the colonial capitalist state, in its close connection with the private sphere of corporations, you know, dispossesses indigenous peoples, but in a way also dispossesses all of us, because it's this system, it's this kind of totality that has led to climate breakdown. So that's how, that's I hope answers some of the first part of the question. In terms of climate activism and making the link between climate activism and Palestine, again, it goes back to this recognition of the fact that colonial capitalism, colonization, is at the root of the climate crisis. And in my local sphere where I work, it's actually the Center for Climate Justice on our campus that has done the most Palestine work. That's been the safe place to do Palestine organizing. And when we talk about rising authoritarianism and, you know, in its sort of more extreme manifestation that we see in places like India, fascism, but in you know, in terms of that gap that we're seeing close, you know, the repression of Palestine speech on Palestine, speech about the genocide has been extraordinary. And speaking as an academic, the repression of academics, mainly racialized people and indigenous peoples, which is another aspect of this that we need to acknowledge, although I guess Germany's an exception to that in a big way. But, you know, I think that it's been quite interesting to see that the climate justice movement, at least in some places, has really risen to this challenge and actually opened up spaces for people to make precisely these connections. So.
Yes, I mean, this is also something to think about in the context of the Netherlands. We see that a lot of coalitional organizing taking place between pro-Palestine student and staff organizing within the university and Extinction Rebellion, for example. You see that there's a lot of shared organizing there. But I was also thinking, as you were talking about climate crisis and the kind of the coalitional politics between climate activists and Palestine activists, I was also thinking about the ways in which actually we see now states, and I'm thinking here of settler colonial states like Israel, using and hijacking the language of ecocide, right? The killing and the death of the earth, which is in itself state-sanctioned, facilitated by capitalist, you know, late capitalist states, and sometimes even inflicted on the earth, as we have seen in the current ecocide in Gaza. There's an interesting kind of use of that language through imposing certain eco-fascist and kind of nationalist measures, right? I mean, think, for example, of practices of, we talked a little bit today, of forestation. You know, forestation being used as a practice of conserving, you know, nature or ecologies, whilst at the same time dispossessing, for example, in the Naqab, you know, the Bedouins from the Naqab, that's an example. Or, for example, think about and I think the work of Jumana Manna is very interesting here to reference, who looks particularly at the ways in which the Israeli state and park authorities uses kind of this argument of protection of certain herbs from extinction in order to ban foraging. So it's also something to think about. You know, we think about the climate crisis, we think about ecocide, but we also see instances in which states themselves do kind of purport that language of ecocide through eco-fascist and nationalist projects and measures. Yeah.
I mean, that it's really interesting. I mean, I think all of the greenwashing that states like Israel and Canada, maybe ground zero for greenwashing, you know, have embarked on has really now become completely indefensible, you know, over the last, 7 months, certainly. But I think that the other interesting avenue that Israel, or I would say that, you know, Zionists are now asserting is that they're indigenous to the land. So they've adopted the language of indigeneity, right? Which is going much further than greenwashing. It's something else altogether. And I think it's really interesting to see what the response has been from different indigenous scholars, like, for instance, Leanne Beto Samosake Simpson, who, in conversation with a Palestinian scholar, I believe, you know, has talked about what the meaning of indigeneity is now in this moment, and how, you know, one of the key pieces of evidence, let's say, that exposes this sort of cynical use of the language of indigeneity by Zionists is the fact that, you know, indigenous ways of being, and I'm not trying to romanticize that category of indigeneity, but even if we look at something like UNDRIP, you know, it recognizes that indigeneity generally means a relationship to land, as Yvonne was saying right at the beginning of her talk so beautifully. You know, I won't try and rephrase or re-articulate, just to recall what Yvonne was saying at the beginning of her talk. And I think that when we look at how Israel and Zionists have really based their use of land on a European model of colonization, down to its form of agriculture and industry, it really reveals that this co-optation of the language of indigeneity is quite a cynical exercise.
Thank you. I just realized I need to get my phone, so I keep an eye on the time. Sorry. Yeah, we're fine. I would like to move on to a question to you, Yvonne. You mention, you speak about the burial of the umbilical cord in the soil. You speak about ancestral burials on farmlands. And you kind of address that as a way of establishing a different claim of belonging to the land, right? Which undoes kind of property relation to the land. So I was wondering if you maybe could further expand on that, precisely because they both signify these practices, both the beginning of life and the end of life, but also they're very much linked to the question of presence on land, presence both in life and in death. And so I was wondering if you could maybe discuss that a bit further.
Thank you so much for that question, Layal. I think that it's very important because, again, it brings the voice of the farm worker into the room in ways that they would have liked to have this kind of conversation. I mentioned earlier that, this is a different language, first of all. Different words are used to think about the idea of belonging to land. And this is a language that comes from people who by law are denied belonging. Because, as I said earlier, of the predominant private property paradigm in South Africa. But also, maybe to get to even legislation that is supposed to work, for lack of a better way of putting it, in favor of farm workers. Even that kind of legislation doesn't quite work. And so they provide us then a language. If the law doesn't work, if the policy doesn't work, we have the language to tell you what it means to think about ways to belong on land, to exist on land, in ways, by the way, even though it is about the umbilical cord, which can be read as an individual and a personal thing, even though it's about the graves and ancestral graves through a lineage that traces people to families, but also understanding that they share the land with others. That is not just the umbilical cord of the Phyllis family, and that is not just the ancestral lands of the Phyllis family, but that here there are also Omukwena, that here there are also Ololo, that here there are also other families in ways that is different from what you find when we talk about ownership, that it's the kings that have owned that land, and it's the land of the kings, and it is just about the king's family. So it's a different way of understanding land, to understand that you can, land is life, to understand that it's personal, but to understand that it can be shared with others. Because to talk about umbilical cord is to understand that it's not a practice, although not practiced by all, but it's not a practice that is exclusive to the Phyllis family. So then, the same with the ancestral graves, but also to insist, because what happens even in land redistribution, I shared earlier, that the law in South Africa, for instance, that protects or is supposed to protect farm workers is the Extension of Security of Tenure Act, which is linked to the constitutional provision that people should have secure tenure. But I argue that secure tenure does not speak directly to the demands of the farm workers. Because what it does, it legislates their longevity on the land, but it also legislates precarity. That people can exist on land and be recognized to exist on land, but never securely. Because security of tenure doesn't talk or speak to or respond to the ways in which they are claiming belonging to the land, in ways that recognizing the significance of this idea of the umbilical cord and the significance of the graves. And so that language is a complete critique of the private property paradigm. It's a complete critique of what the law provides for farm workers. And I said this earlier, and I want to say it again, that it must be clear what land redistribution is in South Africa and other contexts, in the same ways that it was very clear who the beneficiaries of colonialism, of apartheid were. Because we're talking about generations, decades, centuries of people's life having been disrupted in the most devastating way. And so when people then insist, even after centuries, to say what you may say about property, about ownership, but this is how we will insist and continue to resist and continue to craft a different language about what it means to belong to land. So it is a different claim to belonging. It's different to the law. It's different to the provisions in government policy. It's about looking at the personal, but understanding that other people too have a belonging, which is very different then to the predominant paradigm, which is private property. Yeah.
Thank you so much for such a concise and sharp answer, Yvonne. I would like to continue more this conversation, but unfortunately we have 12 more minutes, and I would like to ask Ruth a question before we move on to take a couple of questions from the audience. So hopefully we can fit that all in 15 minutes or so. You said earlier, Ruth, that, and I think we all agree that private property is at the root of all oppressions. And I presume many of us here are with you in wanting to make socialism from the ground up, as you said. I would hope so. But I'm particularly interested in what you said, as in, freedom is also the freedom to inhabit a place and to organize modes of living or ways of living that undo property relations. And this is what we've been already discussing now with Yvonne. But I'm particularly interested for those of us here, maybe or of the audience who are not very familiar with the centrality or the importance of spatiality and geography to your work. You speak about freedom as a place, freedom as a practice of placemaking. You speak both about carceral geographies, but you also, say carceral geographies are in a dialectical relations with abolition geographies. And so the emphasis on space and geography seems to be at the heart of your thinking and your work. And I was wondering whether maybe you could expand a little bit on that. This question had come up earlier also in our conversation. So I thought, since you're here, it would be great if you would speak about it. Hello, hello. Oh, muted. How do we unmute? Sorry.
All right. Yeah. I was telling you the camera came on. Now you can hear me, right?
Yes.
And it's wonderful to see all of you. So let me speak about this briefly so we have some time to talk with the audience. Maybe a way to think about geography is to think about how capitalist modernity has been a system to rationalize the entire earth and relationships between and among living and not living creatures on the earth. So not only people, all kinds of creatures. And that private property then emerges, as Comrade Brenna has so beautifully explained, both in her talk today and very much in her publications, how property becomes the means through which this rationalization takes form and becomes, in a certain way, just how people think about the world. So I could say common sense, but I don't really want to go down the Gramsci path. So when we think, therefore, about property expressing without speaking certain kinds of relations, we not only think about things like whose country is this, or whose plot of land is this, or whose machine is this, but also surrender before the fact the possibility of realizing the fruits of one's labor, whether a farm worker, a factory worker, a teacher, or something else, or moving around. There are some of us who are part of an eternal middle passage, whether we want to be or not, we are. And one of the great kind of overlaying systems through which this rationalization changes its shape but not its purpose is the ongoing forms that imperialism takes. And I will say again that Comrade Brenna brought up all of these examples where the forces that divide people from the land, from one another, from resources, from the ability to move around or the ability to stay put, are at once militarized forces, but also the beliefs that people bring to imagining who can do or be where, as well as the global forces of patents and intellectual property and all of that. Like all of it is part of imperialism today. So the last thing I want to say is if we're thinking as explicitly and deeply as possible about how we come to an understanding of the world, whether we're understanding carceral geography or its antagonistic contradiction, abolition geography, then what we're doing is putting together and then trying to understand narrative orderings of time and geometric orderings of space. And there is no time without space. There is no space without time. But this is part of what's become rationalized under capitalist modernity, is the notion that these things are separable. And what Marx wrote about, the annihilation of space by time, is part of what we're trying to undo. I'll pause there because I know we want to get to the audience.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you very much, Ruth, for your response. We literally have less than 5 minutes for a couple of questions, so I think we should move on to that. Any questions from the audience? Comments, reflections, requests for clarifications? It doesn't have to be a well-articulated question. Thoughts? Yes.
Hello.
Voy a hablar en español. Marwa me va a hacer el favor de traducir. I'm going to speak in Spanish, but Marwa is going to translate. Mi nombre es Samantha, vengo de Colombia. Trabajo con organizaciones campesinas, indígenas y de mujeres, precisamente buscando liberar la tierra, buscando generar formas que se piense en el cuidado de las comunidades y la tierra que nos sostiene. Y para mí realmente es un honor escucharlas hoy a ustedes acá. Creo que las propuestas que exponen sobre cómo la privatización de la tierra es la raíz de todas las violencias que estamos viviendo hoy y esa conexión tan clara con las crisis que vivimos hoy en día es realmente demasiado poderoso y creo que también acá está el poder del encuentro entre luchas y entre personas que se están pensando el futuro o diversos futuros alternativos al modelo de de muerte y de explotación. Y creo que realmente es demasiado importante comprender que la muerte no es el fin, ¿cierto? O sea, como lo propone la compañera desde la idea de cómo se entiende la ancestralidad, desde la relación con la tierra y también creo que es muy importante pensar cómo generar que estos conocimientos lleguen también y nos permitan conectarnos a las diferentes luchas y resistencias para seguirnos pensando esto, porque creo que tenemos que ser radicales, porque no estamos en un momento de pensar en el proceso, porque realmente estamos en una coyuntura ante la muerte. Entonces, quería agradecerles realmente por todo esto.
Yeah, so Samantha just said, hello, my name is Samantha. I'm from Colombia and I work with indigenous and campesinos and campesinas organizations in el sur de Tolima and norte del Cauca. We are trying in our work to liberate land. It's an honor listening to you. Also like going back to the question that the root of all violence is a privatization of land, which is very scary moment we are going through, and also listening to the alternative or like a different propositions or different languages and this languages that you are bringing to us to relate to death. So death is not an end, becomes not an end in itself, but also relating through death becoming like a possibility to another relationship to land. I would like to say that the importance of the production of all these different knowledges, and I couldn't no me recuerda la última parte. Sharing, the importance, I would like to emphasize the importance of this dialogue, this conversation, and the sharing of knowledges that we are doing. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Would any of our speakers like to respond to this intervention? Okay, maybe we'll get another question first then.
First of all, thank you all for such a great talk. I have a question for Ruth. I was reminded during this conversation of a post published by one of the comrades in Berlin earlier today. He published this post following the eviction of an encampment or a student occupation that lasted for 30 hours in the University of Humboldt, in which the building the building of the Department of Social Sciences was renamed Jabalia Institute. And in that last line of the post, he says, Gaza, he said, I'll say it first in Arabic, غزة رح تغير شكل العالم. Gaza is going to change the shape or the form of the world. So it kind of brought back this question of form for me, and particularly this relationship that Marwa highlighted between form and organizing. So I wanted to actually bounce Marwa's question back to you and ask you what your thoughts are about this. Like, what forms of organizing can we think about in the wake of the Gaza genocide?
That for me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you both from the audience who made questions and comments. a couple of things come to mind. The first is that the forms of organizing tend to have lots of different configurations, and that is a good thing, not a bad thing. That people figure out forms based in what their concrete needs are, what the possibilities of organizing, especially organizing with already organized people, as well as organizing people who are not yet organized. That said, I think it's also true that as we figure out the social and spatial struggle as it moves forward, we can see examples around the world of people who who devise, as it were, provisional ways to rehearse the future by organizing a form such as the Abashali settlements in South Africa or the land occupations in Brazil, and keep those going. In another case where things are also really, really difficulty is in Sudan, and this I learned from Comrade Nisreen El Amin recently. She teaches at the University of Toronto, that there is an entire kind of revolutionary edifice that's been built all around Sudan that is organized, well, the word translated into English is rooms. So these are revolution rooms, and the rooms are the places where organizing is happening, not because a room is adequate or sufficient to revolution, but that is the spatial form that this social and revolutionary activity is taking. Or to go to Colombia, and this is something I learned from the vice president of Colombia, I think she is Francia Marquez. She decided to run for political office there, which is to say, to use the state to undo the colonial state, which is what she and Petro and their comrades are trying to do, in part because she saw the persistent displacement of direct producers in rural Colombia, whose land was taken and then transformed into cash crops for export to the global north, whether those cash crops are to make biofuels, so that people in the global north can feel like they're saving the planet by driving a healthier car, or for other purposes. But that displacement has been met with the expansion in Colombia of prisons. And we can see displacements of the same sort all throughout the arable lands of not only the global South, but also North America, including Canada, where people's lands have been seized by pension funds and international financial institutions, as well as global capitalists, to transform the land to the production of goods that are only available to and usable by the very, very few. So these are all examples of both the form of the struggle and the kinds of forms that people devise to be able to address their concrete demands as they continue to rehearse into a future where that work grows. And the last thing I want to say, I know I've talked too long, is that many people, both in and outside of Palestine, have said, and rightly so, for many years, we are not free until Palestine is free. the world is not free until Palestine is free. And I believe that. And I believe it in many ways. And it's not magical, it's really practical. That the struggle for the emancipation of Palestine and the struggle for the emancipation of everyone who is not in Palestine or not Palestinian is connected, because all of the contradictions are connected. And if we are not brave enough to struggle at once for the emancipation of Palestine and for the emancipation of our land and our livelihoods wherever we are, then the end will not come to capitalist modernity ever.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ruth. I hope after such wonderful closing remarks, we can maybe keep a vow to ourselves and our comrades here that we will rehearse and rehearse and rehearse different forms of organizing and ways of living until Palestine is free. Free Palestine. And thank you so much for all the speakers, of course. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you so much.